Hello, it's Friday, September 11th. Let's talk PlayStation. Alright, so, oh yeah, I got the PS... I've been using my PS3 recently, so that's why that's on in the background. Anyway, so this past week, September 9th, actually, is when the original PlayStation launched in North America. So Sony's been kind of celebrating that recently. They posted an original unboxing of the PlayStation on their YouTube channel, which I thought was really, really cool. If you go to the Share Factory app, where you can, edit PS4 gameplay, they actually have a new little intro thing that you can use there, where you can use the original PlayStation boot up in your videos now. And I always like when Sony does things like this. They're getting really nostalgic recently. They're really celebrating, their lineage of PlayStation products and things like that. And I don't know, I've always been a sucker for those things, so I really appreciate the fact that Sony does that stuff often. Anyway, let's talk about a lot of PlayStation exclusives and sort of like what's going on with them. So the first one, Polyphony Digital has a lot of job listings opening up for the developer, and no big surprise here, they want experience with PlayStation 4, also PC, and also mobile. Mobile might tell you that they probably want to make like a companion app or something for Gran Turismo 7 when it inevitably does come out. And that's kind of the question here is, when is that thing actually going to come out? They also are looking at possibly increasing sort of the AI intelligence in the game, and want to make it, of course they want to make a lot of vast improvements to Gran Turismo, but the one thing that Kazunori Yamauchi always keeps telling us is that you won't have to be waiting that long for GT7. So it's, they're really kind of ramping up, development here. So I'm just wondering, like, when are we going to actually see a formal announcement of GT7? And I'm thinking, maybe next E3. Now let's talk about some Killzone, namely, what's going on there. And the managing director for Guerrilla Games, Herman Holst, recently commented on this, basically saying that it's too early to comment on Killzone, but certainly the interest is not lost. In fact, he was quoted as saying, "My enthusiasm for Horizon by no means should suggest that I'm now uninterested in Killzone. We love that franchise, we really do, but it's too early for me to comment on future projects. It's going to be a very big challenge for us to get Horizon out the door. And as for what's going to happen after that, we'll talk about that later." And that's of course a very, very fair comment to make here. I mean, they are doing Horizon, which is a full-scale RPG basically, and we all know games like those typically take a very long time to actually develop. And their previous project before that was Shadowfall, which was a PlayStation 4 launch title. That's certainly a daunting task. But they're getting all these new sort of assets and things ready for Horizon. But the thing is, I'm glad that Killzone isn't, kind of just brushed aside, like we'll never see that franchise again. A lot of people do look at that franchise and go, it was never that big, I don't like Killzone that much, move on to something else. And I'm certainly in the party where it's like, I want to see Guerrilla Games do something else, which is why I'm happy they're doing Horizon, but I am one of those people that does like Killzone a lot. I thoroughly enjoy the Killzone games, and the Killzone games have a very strong following, so I want to see them possibly make a return at some point. Which kind of segues nicely into our next news story, which is Resistance. So somebody on Twitter was commenting about how, we want to see a Resistance HD remaster on PlayStation 4, and Insomniac Games responded to this in a tweet, basically saying that we don't do remasters, but we would support a remaster for Resistance. And a fan followed up commenting saying, who owns the IP and stuff like that, and they commented back saying that we created the game, but Sony owns the IP. It's kind of, the ball's kind of in their court for decisions like that. So if Sony wants to do a remaster for Resistance, they don't need Insomniac's permission. They don't need Insomniac to do the remaster at all. They can go do this and fund this whenever the hell they want to. It's just a matter of, will Sony actually do something like that, which I would absolutely love to see. And it's not certainly out of the realms of possibility, since Sony loves doing ports and remasters, whether it's a Vita game going to PS3, or a Vita game going to PS4, or a PS3 game going to PS4. Like, they love just putting games everywhere wherever they're available and giving them a nice little facelift. So Resistance is one of those games where I would definitely love to see something like that. And then also Insomniac also mentioned in response to the obvious question that they always get asked, you're going to do another Resistance, and they commented saying, no, we've been pretty open about this, we're not doing Resistance again. Which, if you do kind of look at the history of their comments on this, it's initially Ted Price came out and said, we're not doing Resistance anymore. Then he kind of backtracked and said, never say never, and then we're back to more comments of them saying we're not doing Resistance anymore. So, but Insomniac, whatever, just you do you. keep making great games. So the one news story I really want to talk about with you guys was a recent interview that came out from a former Microsoft president of their entertainment and devices division. He commented about, a number of things, Xbox's past and how Xbox One's doing and how they could have sort of avoided the mistakes that the Xbox One went through and things like that. The one interesting thing that he talked about is he was asked, do you think we'll have another, generation of consoles and will they have physical media? He was quoted as saying, probably not. So how does that look? Is it just a game box or is it more? What's the balance between what an Apple TV is and what an Xbox or a PlayStation 4 is? These are really interesting questions, and the team's going to have to wrestle with those. That next generation will be a whole new game. So you've got somebody who, of course, was a very high leading position of Microsoft, made a bunch of huge somewhat billion-dollar decisions on, how Microsoft was doing with Xbox and things like that, right? This is a guy that certainly had a big place in the industry, and he thinks the next generation of consoles aren't going to have physical media, but that there certainly will be another generation of consoles. And whenever we talk about sort of the long-term future in games, there's always a lot of crazy people that have either these absurd opinions where it's like there's consoles are going to die at some point, or that consoles are going to die in a very, very quick amount of time. Certainly, there are people that think that there's not going to be another consoles, which that's kind of a ridiculous thing to think of right now, considering PS4, Xbox One are doing unbelievably well right now and are still selling at a faster rate than the previous generation of consoles. So clearly, consoles are not going away anytime soon. It's just a matter of what they're going to essentially turn into, because the market does have to evolve in a sense. It does have to change for the better. It does have to sort of adapt, right? The way consoles have traditionally worked in terms of one set piece of hardware that is on the market for 4, 5, 6, 7+ years, that's not going to, I think we all can agree that that's not going to hold very, very long. And physical media, is that going to stay around for how long? There's always the argument that it's absolutely still going to have a place because, stuff like CDs are still around. Even though they sell nowhere near as much as they used to, there is still a place for CDs. There is still a place for Blu-rays. There is still a place for physical media. And especially with games. Certainly digital sales of games are going up, but people still buy discs. And the absurd thing is that people think Sony and Microsoft are just going to someday just decide, you know what, we're not going to do another console. Which is, again, it's absurd to think about, because they wouldn't come to that conclusion until they do a PS5, 6, and 7, or an Xbox, the next 3 Xboxes, and they all fail, right? That's when a hardware manufacturer will probably say at some point, okay, now let's quit. They're not going to have a successful hardware launch like PS4 and X1, and then decide, okay, let's stop right there. They're clearly going to keep releasing consoles until it doesn't work anymore. That's when they will exit the market. So, again, of course, consoles are going to stick around. It's just, what are they going to be? What are they going to turn into? And it's always this discussion of whether it's streaming, whether it's going to be, whether they're going to be set-top boxes, whether they're going to be download only and things like that. And it's just a tough conversation to have, because it's long-term technology talk, and when you're talking long-term technology, it's so hard to be even somewhat accurate because technology is moving so rapidly. There's only the only thing we can really do is just speculate, because more often than not, most people's guesses are as good as anyone else's. Now, I will say, in response to the former president of Microsoft's Entertainment and Devices division, he thinks that the next consoles won't have discs. I personally don't agree with that. I think they absolutely will still use physical media. But he brings up a good point. The recent announcement of the new Apple TV. If you don't know, Apple recently announced a new Apple TV, and it's more of a local storage sort of device, right? This thing does have gigabytes on it. It is going to be able to run more applications. Developers have access to this thing now, and people can basically put games on the Apple TV. And of course, there were all these absurd, crazy editorials where people were saying, Apple TV was going to kill PS4 and Xbox One, which is, of course, absolute bullshit. We don't even need to have a discussion about that because it's nowhere close to the traditional sense of consoles. But it certainly is interesting that Apple's entered that sort of idea where it's like, okay, it's easy to develop, applications on Apple TV and things like that. But when you look at something like the Apple TV, that's going to be a device where it's not going to be like, Apple TV, the current one, right? That's going to come out soon. That's going to come out. It's going to have games, right? And then Apple's going to release another Apple TV, but games will only run on that new one. Like, that's not really going to be how it's going to operate, right? We all have smartphones and things like that, and how that usually operates is it's kind of the same thing in terms of PCs. You know, you can make small incremental upgrades to it, but your games are still going to be able to run on it. It's just a matter of how well will they run, where's the compatibility in that sense, and I personally feel that's where consoles should go in a direction. I don't even think it's, I'm not even going to say that that's where they are going, but I feel that's where they should go. Instead of a PlayStation 5, it should be a PlayStation 5.1, then a PlayStation 5.2, 5.3, where there's small incremental upgrades to the RAM, hardware, everything like that, right? But it's still, games can still run basically on all versions of a PlayStation 5, quote unquote, if you get what I'm saying, right? It's just a matter of how the games are going to scale accordingly to the hardware, and games are going to be developed in a more open source sort of situation where it's like you can put the game into whatever PlayStation you have. It's just that if you have a more recent one, you can very much so like a PC, get better performance out of the games, things like that. I mean, that's basically how mobile works right now. That's how PC has worked for a very long time, you know. And it'll get to a point where there's certainly a sort of, you know, cutoff to it. You know, there are certain games that are on the App Store for iPhone, for example, where it's like they are not going to run on an iPhone, you know, 3G. You know what I'm saying? So there certainly is a cutoff there, but it's just one of those things where it'd be a more open platform, and instead of set boxes that are on the market for 4 or 5 years and then, you know, get incredibly outdated very, very quickly, that's where consoles would drastically change in a sense. You know, I personally don't feel we're going in a digital landscape just yet in terms of 100% digital on consoles. I personally don't feel streaming 100% is the answer. It will certainly be an option. It will certainly be there, right? But I don't think that's 100% what a console should be. These are all just my opinions, though, and that's what I like about doing this little YouTube thing, is that we can all talk about this. So, and I know this is a hot topic, a very hot topic that people are going to be dropping in the comments, so by all means, fire off. Anyways, those are just some of the news stories I want to talk about with you guys. The Ride on Gaming topic for this past week was, why do people watch Let's Plays? Seems like a very popular thing on YouTube. People love watching other people play video games. There was that whole what was it? Jimmy Kimmel had that whole thing where he was like, you know, ragging on gamers because people watch, you know, gaming on YouTube. I actually didn't include that in the topic, but either way, it's a good topic. I suggest you go watch that. And also, part 8 of Jak 2 is up. We're still playing Jak 2. That's going great. We're having a really fun time there. In fact, let's go back to ROG for a second. Keep submitting Ride on Gaming topics, because if you don't, I'll die. Yep. Sorry. Just the way it is. Okay, maybe that was a lie, but keep submitting topics for sure. Anyway, that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Badecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I'll see you guys next Friday.